Bacon might seem simple, but there are more ways to get it wrong than you think. From the heat you use to when the bacon actually hits the hob, small choices can make a big difference. And unfortunately, most people never realize what's going wrong. If your bacon often turns out burnt at the edges, chewy in the middle, or sitting in a pan full of oil, it's probably not the bacon's fault. It's the method. Many of the most common bacon cooking habits in Britain are passed down, repeated, and rarely questioned, even when they work against the result everyone actually wants. The truth is, cooking great bacon isn't about fancy ingredients or expensive equipment. It's about understanding how fat, heat, and timing work together. Today, we're breaking down the biggest mistakes every Briton makes when cooking bacon and showing you why they matter more than you might expect. Once you spot these errors, fixing them is surprisingly easy. Straight from the fridge, straight into the fire. For many people, cooking bacon starts with urgency. The pan goes on the hob. The heat is turned up, and while it's warming, the bacon comes straight out of the fridge and into the sizzle. It feels efficient, especially on a busy morning when breakfast needs to be done quickly. The louder the pan sounds, the more it feels like things are going right. The problem is that bacon isn't built for that kind of shock. It isn't just meat, it's layers of muscle threaded through thick seams of fat, and that fat needs time. When cold bacon hits a pan that's already hot, the fat doesn't gently melt. It tightens instantly. Instead of slowly rendering out and coating the pan evenly, it locks up, forcing the meat to cook before the fat has had a chance to do what it's supposed to do. That's why rushed bacon often looks cooked, but feels wrong when you bite into it. The edges burn quickly while the middle struggles to keep up. The fat stays chewy, sometimes almost rubbery, and the pan fills with oil in an uneven way that makes the bacon fry and scorch at the same time. Once that process starts, there's no way to reverse it. You can turn the heat down, flip it constantly, or move it around the pan, but the texture is already compromised. What surprises most people is how simple the fix actually is. Instead of preheating the pan, the bacon should go into a cold pan first, then be brought up to temperature slowly over medium or medium-low heat. As the pan warms gradually, the fat warms with it. It melts smoothly, renders out properly, and creates its own cooking surface. The bacon cooks evenly, browns instead of burning, and develops that balance of crispness and tenderness people are usually chasing without realizing it. It takes a few extra minutes, but the difference is immediate. Once you see how much better the bacon behaves when it isn't rushed at the start, it becomes hard to ignore how many other small, everyday decisions in the kitchen quietly work against the final result, especially when it comes to what the bacon is actually cooking in. The wrong pan is working against you. For something cooked as often as bacon, surprisingly little thought goes into the pan it's cooked in. Most people reach for whatever frying pan happens to be clean, place it on the hob, and assume the heat will take care of the rest. As long as the pan is flat and big enough to hold a few rashers, it feels like the choice doesn't really matter. But with bacon, the pan plays a much bigger role than most people realize. Lightweight pans, especially thin aluminium ones, heat up very quickly and unevenly. Some spots get extremely hot while others lag behind, and when bacon hits those hot spots, the edges burn before the rest of the strip has even begun to cook properly. That's often why you end up with blackened corners and pale, floppy centers, even though everything went into the pan at the same time. This uneven heat also makes it harder to control how the fat renders. Instead of slowly melting and spreading across the surface, the fat is forced to react to sudden bursts of high temperature. The result is bacon that spits aggressively, releases oil too fast, and cooks in fits and starts rather than in a steady, predictable way. You're left constantly adjusting the heat and moving the bacon around, trying to compensate for what the pan isn't doing for you. Heavier pans behave very differently. Cast iron, in particular, heats more slowly but holds onto that heat evenly once it gets there. That steady temperature gives the fat time to render properly and allows the meat to brown without scorching. The bacon cooks more uniformly from edge to center, and the process feels calmer, Less frantic flipping, less splattering, and fewer burnt surprises. There's also a practical bonus that builds over time. Each time bacon is cooked in a cast iron pan, a small amount of fat bonds to the surface, gradually improving the pan's natural seasoning. In other words, the bacon makes the pan better, and the pan makes the bacon better in return. It's a cycle most people miss out on simply because they've never questioned what they're cooking in. Once you realize how much influence the pan has, it becomes clear that even with the right heat and timing, things can still go wrong if the cooking surface itself is fighting you. And that's before you even consider how hot most people instinctively turn the hob. Cooking bacon like you're late for work. There's a strong temptation to cook bacon as fast as possible. The pan goes on, the heat is turned up high, and the goal becomes getting colour on the meat quickly so breakfast can be finished and forgotten about. For a lot of people, especially on weekdays, bacon is treated less like something to cook and more like something to get out of the way. The problem is that bacon simply doesn't respond well to impatience. High heat gives the illusion of progress, loud sizzling, rapid browning, dramatic spitting. But most of that activity is happening too quickly for the bacon to cook properly. The outside races ahead while the inside struggles to catch up, and the fat never gets the time it needs to render slowly and evenly. When bacon is cooked too hot, moisture escapes rapidly. The meat tightens, the fat shrinks, and instead of staying supple as it cooks, everything dries out. That's when bacon turns brittle rather than crisp, snapping instead of bending, and tasting more scorched than savoury. It's especially noticeable with thicker rashers, which can look well cooked on the surface while remaining oddly tough underneath. This habit is easy to fall into because the damage isn't always obvious straight away. Bacon cooked on high heat often looks appealing at first glance, but the texture tells a different story once it's on the plate. The fat feels firm instead of tender, the meat lacks juiciness, and the overall flavour is harsher than it needs to be. What you're tasting isn't richness, it's the result of rushing the process. Lowering the heat changes everything. Medium or medium-low heat allows the bacon to cook gradually, giving the fat time to melt and baste the meat as it cooks. Instead of fighting the pan, the bacon relaxes into it. The sizzling becomes quieter and steadier, the oil releases in a controlled way, and the strips brown evenly without burning. Once you get used to this slower approach, it becomes obvious how often bacon is overcooked, simply because people mistake intensity for effectiveness. And when you combine high heat with another very common habit, trying to cook too much at once, the results only get worse. Trying to cook too much at once. When bacon is on the menu, it's very tempting to load the pan. One more rasher won't hurt, and if you can squeeze them all in at once, it feels like you're saving time. For families, shared breakfasts, or even just hunger doing the thinking, overcrowding the pan feels practical and efficient. In reality, it's one of the quickest ways to ruin an entire batch. Bacon needs space, not just so it fits, but so it can actually cook. As the fat renders, it needs somewhere to go. When rashers are packed tightly together, that fat has nowhere to escape. And instead of frying properly, the bacon begins to steam in its own moisture. The pan fills with oil, but the strips themselves are pressed against each other, trapping heat and vapor in all the wrong places. That's why overcrowded bacon often turns out limp and pale, even after spending plenty of time on the hob. The meat softens instead of crisping, and the fat stays floppy rather than turning golden and tender. You can flip the rashers again and again, but the environment in the pan is already working against you. What makes this mistake particularly frustrating is that it doesn't look like a mistake while it's happening. The pan is hot, the bacon is sizzling, and everything appears to be progressing normally. It's only when the bacon comes out that the problem becomes clear. Uneven texture, greasy surfaces, and strips that never quite firm up the way you expect them to. The fix is simple but requires restraint. Leaving even a small gap between each rasher gives the fat room to render and the heat space to circulate. The bacon fries instead of steams, and the difference in texture is immediate. Cooking in batches might take a little longer, but each batch actually finishes properly instead of hovering in an awkward middle ground. Interestingly, the opposite mistake can be just as problematic. Cooking only 1 or 2 rashers in a large pan often leads to scorching because there isn't enough fat released to protect the surface. Bacon, it turns out, behaves best when it's given just the right amount of company. Not too crowded, not too lonely. Once you start paying attention to how much bacon you're cooking at once, it becomes easier to see why some methods feel unnecessarily stressful, especially when there are easier ways to cook larger amounts without standing over the hob at all. Standing over the hob for no good reason. For many people, cooking bacon automatically means standing at the stove, watching the pan, flipping rashers, dodging splatters, and wiping oil off the counter as they go. It feels hands-on and familiar, like that's simply how bacon is supposed to be cooked. If you walk away, it feels like something will go wrong. But that assumption is exactly what keeps people stuck doing more work than they need to, especially when cooking bacon for more than 1 or 2 people. On the hob, bacon demands constant attention. Heat fluctuates, fat spits unpredictably, and one distracted moment can mean burnt edges or oil overflowing the pan. The process becomes reactive rather than controlled. You're not guiding the cooking so much as responding to problems as they appear. This is where a lot of people don't realize there's an easier option sitting right in front of them: the oven. Cooking bacon in the oven removes nearly all the chaos. Instead of fighting hot spots on a pan, the bacon cooks in consistent, even heat. The fat renders slowly, the rashers stay flat, and everything finishes at roughly the same time. There's no need to flip constantly, no sudden flare-ups, and far less mess spreading across the kitchen. It's especially noticeable when cooking for several people. Rather than juggling batches on the hob, you can lay everything out on a baking tray, slide it into the oven and let it cook while you focus on the rest of breakfast, or simply step away altogether. The result is bacon that's evenly cooked, properly crisped, and far more predictable than most stovetop attempts. And this is a good moment to pause for a second, because if you're finding these small changes useful already, it really helps the channel when you tap like and subscribe. It lets YouTube know this kind of practical breakdown is worth showing to more people, and it means you won't miss the next one. What often surprises people is that oven bacon doesn't feel like a compromise once they try it. It feels calmer, cleaner, and more reliable. And once you stop hovering over the pan, you start to notice other habits that might seem harmless, but quietly affect the final result more than most people expect. The mistake that sounds wrong until you try it. For most people, bacon and water simply don't belong in the same sentence. Cooking bacon is usually framed as a dry heat process: hot pan, rendered fat, crisp edges. So the idea of deliberately adding water feels counterintuitive, almost like undoing everything you're trying to achieve. It sounds like a shortcut to boiled bacon, and that's enough to put most people off immediately. But the purpose of water here isn't to cook the bacon in liquid, it's to control the early stages of cooking in a way most people never think about. When bacon goes into a pan dry, the temperature climbs very quickly. If the pan is even slightly too hot, the fat begins to react before it's ready, tightening and shrinking instead of melting smoothly. This is where uneven cooking starts. The meat firms up, moisture escapes too fast, and the outside can start browning aggressively while the inside is still catching up. Adding a small amount of water changes that entire sequence. As the pan heats, the water absorbs and regulates the heat, preventing sudden temperature spikes. This creates a gentler environment at the beginning of cooking, allowing the bacon to warm through evenly. The fat softens gradually, the meat relaxes, and everything stays in balance. As the water simmers, it slowly evaporates. By the time it's gone, the bacon has already rendered out a good amount of its own fat. At that point, the cooking naturally transitions from simmering to frying without you needing to intervene. The bacon finishes in its own oil, crisping steadily instead of burning unpredictably. This method is especially effective for thicker cut rashers, which are notorious for cooking unevenly. Without that initial moisture, thicker bacon often ends up overdone on the outside and underwhelming in the middle. Water gives those cuts the time they need to cook properly from edge to center before browning begins. What often surprises people most is that the final result doesn't taste watered down in any way. Once the liquid has evaporated, it leaves no trace behind. The flavor is still unmistakably bacon, just fuller, more even, and better textured. The meat stays tender, the fat turns crisp without becoming brittle, and the whole strip feels more cohesive when you bite into it. It's one of those techniques that doesn't advertise itself loudly. It doesn't look impressive while it's happening, and it doesn't rely on fancy equipment. But once you understand what it's doing, it becomes clear why so many people struggle with dry or inconsistent bacon without ever realizing there's a simple adjustment that could change everything. And when texture issues like curling and uneven contact with the pan are added into the mix, even well-rendered bacon can still fall short. Which brings us to another habit most people overlook entirely: letting bacon curl and cook unevenly. Almost everyone has watched bacon curl up in the pan and thought nothing of it. The strips bend, the edges lift, the middle arches, and it's treated as a normal part of the process. You flip it, press it down briefly, and move on. Because it happens every time, it's easy to assume it doesn't really matter, but curling is one of the biggest reasons bacon struggles to cook properly. When bacon begins to warp, large portions of each strip are no longer touching the pan. Those raised sections stop frying altogether and start cooking in a completely different way. Instead of browning against hot metal, they're exposed only to rising steam and residual heat. Meanwhile, the parts still in contact with the pan continue to cook aggressively. The result is bacon that finishes at multiple temperatures all at once. This is why so many rashers look inconsistent on the plate. Some areas are crisp and golden, others are pale and soft, and the fat behaves differently depending on where it happened to be when the strip curled. Even frequent flipping doesn't solve the problem. It just shifts which parts are undercooked and which are overdone. The reason bacon curls in the first place comes down to how meat and fat react to heat. As bacon warms, the muscle fibers contract faster than the fat. That imbalance creates tension, and the strip bends to release it. The faster the heat, the more dramatic the curling. Without anything to counteract that pull, the bacon naturally twists away from the pan. Keeping bacon flat changes everything. When the entire strip stays in contact with the cooking surface, heat is applied evenly from edge to edge. The fat renders consistently, the meat browns at the same pace, and the texture becomes uniform instead of patchy. The bacon stops fighting the pan and starts cooking as a single piece rather than a collection of hot and cold zones. There are a few simple ways people achieve this without much effort. Lower, steadier heat reduces how violently the meat contracts. Allowing the bacon to settle early on helps it relax before it has a chance to twist. Some people gently press the bacon at the start of cooking to encourage even contact, while others rely on methods that naturally keep it flat from the beginning. Once you've cooked bacon this way, it's hard to go back. The difference isn't subtle. The strips look better, feel better to bite into, and behave more predictably every time. And when you start thinking about bacon not as something to constantly manage, but something that can be set up correctly from the start, it opens the door to an approach that saves time, reduces mess, and quietly solves several of these problems at once. Treating bacon grease like waste. Once the bacon is cooked, most people do the same thing without thinking. They tilt the pan, pour the hot oil into the sink or a disposable container, wipe everything down, and move on. The grease is seen as mess, something to get rid of as quickly as possible before it cools and becomes harder to clean. In British kitchens especially, there's a strong instinct to minimize lingering smells and residue, and bacon grease feels like the biggest offender. So it gets thrown away, often without a second thought. But doing that isn't just wasteful, it's also one of the most overlooked mistakes in everyday cooking. Bacon grease is essentially rendered fat, and when it's handled properly, it's an incredibly useful byproduct. During cooking, that fat absorbs flavor from the meat, becoming rich, savory, and far more interesting than plain cooking oil. Throwing it away means discarding something that could improve several other meals with almost no extra effort. The issue is that most people only experience bacon grease at its messiest stage: hot, splattered, and difficult to manage. Without a simple system in place, it feels easier to get rid of it than to deal with it properly. But once the grease is strained and stored, it becomes clean, stable, and surprisingly easy to use. Straining the grease removes burnt bits and impurities, leaving behind a smooth fat that can be kept in a sealed container in the fridge. Once cooled, it firms up but stays soft enough to scoop, spread, or melt again when needed. Used in moderation, it can add depth to eggs, vegetables, soups, and even baked dishes in a way neutral oils simply can't. There's also a practical benefit most people don't realize. Cooking with bacon grease often reduces sticking and improves browning, which means less food clinging to pans and less aggressive scrubbing later. In other words, managing bacon grease well can actually make future cooking cleaner, not messier. What often surprises people is how long it keeps. Properly stored bacon grease lasts weeks in the fridge without issue. Once you get used to having it on hand, pouring it down the drain starts to feel less like tidying up and more like throwing away something useful. And when you combine that mindset with another habit many people overlook, cooking bacon only in small repeated batches instead of preparing it properly all at once, you start to see how much unnecessary effort bacon creates simply because of how it's approached. When you look at all of these mistakes together, a pattern starts to emerge. None of them come from laziness or ignorance. They come from habits, things learned early, repeated often, and rarely questioned. Bacon feels familiar, so most people assume it doesn't require much thought, but as you've seen, small decisions add up quickly. From how the bacon starts in the pan, to the heat it's cooked over, to how much space it's given, each step quietly shapes the final result. Rush it, and the texture suffers. Use the wrong equipment and you end up fighting uneven cooking. Ignore how fat behaves and the bacon never quite becomes what you expect it to be. What's reassuring is that none of these mistakes are difficult to fix. They don't require expensive tools or complicated techniques. Most of the time, it's just about slowing down slightly, paying attention to how bacon reacts to heat, and setting it up properly from the beginning. When that happens, the cooking process becomes calmer, cleaner, and far more predictable. The biggest shift is mindset. Instead of treating bacon as something to get through as quickly as possible, it helps to see it as something that rewards patience and balance. When fat is allowed to render gently, when heat is controlled instead of forced, and when the cooking environment works with the bacon instead of against it, the difference is obvious on the plate. If this breakdown changed how you think about cooking bacon, it would really help if you gave the video a like and subscribe to the channel. It lets YouTube know this kind of practical, everyday food content is worth sharing, and it helps more people stumble across it when they're looking for answers they didn't realize they needed. And if you know someone who always complains about their bacon turning out wrong, or insist they've been doing it the right way for years, this might be a good one to pass along. Because once you start noticing these small details, it's hard not to wonder how many other familiar foods are being quietly let down by habits no one ever taught us to question.